The voice that cut through the quiet afternoon was sharp enough to slice stone. "He's violating Section 7, subsection B. That fence is an eyesore, and it's coming down today." Those words came from Brenda, the self-appointed queen of our HOA. She wasn't pointing at some cheap chain-link barrier. She was pointing at my fence, the single most important piece of safety infrastructure standing between our neighborhood and 20,000 acres of untamed wilderness. I opened my mouth to argue, but her manicured hand was already signaling the demolition crew to move in. Before I dive into this insane story, let me pause here. Before watching the full story, comment below from where you're watching. Also, like and subscribe for more stories. Your support keeps these battles alive. Now, let's go back to how it all started. Before chaos, before lawsuits, before the bears. 3 years earlier, I thought I had found paradise. I had spent most of my adult life as a wildlife biologist, studying the fragile line between civilization and wilderness. When I bought my home on the very edge of a new development, I believed I had discovered the perfect balance. Modern living with a backyard that spilled directly into a vast national forest. I loved the mornings best. Sunlight would filter through the tall pines, deer would graze at the forest's edge, and foxes would sometimes streak across the meadow. It was nature at its finest. Untouched, raw, but manageable. The key word there? Manageable. The developer of our community, a practical old man with more grit than glamour, had understood the risks of building here. He knew that the forest wasn't just filled with pretty deer and playful raccoons. It was also home to coyotes, bobcats, and, most dangerously, black bears. His solution: a specialized wildlife deterrent fence installed along the forest boundary. That fence wasn't just a precaution, it was a silent guardian. High tensile, multi-strand, low voltage, and electrified, it delivered a quick, non-lethal jolt that taught predators to stay away. Bears learned fast. After one shock, they avoided the neighborhood entirely. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't decorative, but it worked, and it was installed on my property line, the largest stretch bordering the forest. My home became the linchpin of the community's safety. Everyone knew it, everyone respected it, and for years, life was peaceful. But peace never lasts long when people like Brenda arrive. Brenda moved in 2 years after me, buying the flashiest house in the center of the development. She didn't come for peace. She came to reign. A woman who had spent her entire life in sterile gated communities. She looked at our forest like it was a golf course gone wild. She drove a spotless white Range Rover that gleamed like a diamond, wore luxury yoga outfits as if they were battle armor, and smiled with just enough sweetness to mask the venom beneath. Within 6 months, she had clawed her way into power as HOA president, and that's when the dream started to crack. First, it was lawn ornaments, banned, then mailboxes, replaced with overpriced versions sold through her brother-in-law's company. Slowly, the neighborhood's personality disappeared, replaced by Brenda's vision of prestige and uniformity. But her obsession didn't stop at mailboxes or garden gnomes. No, Brenda's eyes eventually landed on something much bigger, much stronger, and much more important: my fence. To her, it wasn't safety, it wasn't protection, it wasn't science. It was ugly, and in Brenda's world, ugly had no place. The first time I realized Brenda had her sights set on me was when a neatly folded letter appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't a friendly welcome to the neighborhood note. It was a warning. Dear Mr. Harrison, as president of the Homeowners Association, I must remind you of our community's strict aesthetic guidelines. Your fence does not comply with the required design standards and must be brought into conformity. Please consider replacing it with decorative aluminum fencing, which will better reflect our community's prestige. Prestige. That was Brenda's favorite word, one she wielded like a weapon. I chuckled at first, thinking she just didn't understand. I wrote her a polite response attaching a copy of my deed, the original developer's agreement, and an explanation of the fence's scientific purpose. I even included diagrams showing how the low-voltage deterrent worked, non-lethal, safe, but absolutely necessary. I thought logic would win. I was naive. A month later, another letter arrived. This one was colder, sharper. Now it wasn't a suggestion. It was a fine. Hundreds of dollars for non-compliance. It was laughable until it wasn't. See, Brenda had something more powerful than logic: control over the board. She'd charmed them, flattered them, and, in some cases, outright bullied them into submission. The board wasn't made of leaders. It was made of yes men. Timid neighbors too busy with their jobs and kids to question her authority. George, my neighbor 2 doors down, was the first to warn me. He was an old-timer, one of the original homeowners, and he'd seen Brenda's game before. She fined the Millers $500 because their kid's basketball hoop was orange, George told me one night sipping a beer on his porch. Said it clashed with the neighborhood color scheme. That woman's got the board wrapped around her. Little finger. You'd better watch yourself. He was right. The next HOA meeting I attended, I walked in with a full presentation. Maps, migration patterns, case studies. I showed them exactly what would happen if the fence came down. Trash raids, property damage, bear encounters. I wasn't just a resident. I was an expert in the field. I was giving them free consultation that governments paid thousands for. But Brenda, she didn't see expertise. She saw defiance. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we appreciate your little animal lecture. But this isn't National Geographic. This is a neighborhood. Our bylaws are clear. Your fence is ugly and non-compliant. The board has spoken." The vote was unanimous, not because they believed her, but because no one had the backbone to oppose her. I left that meeting with one thing clear in my mind. This wasn't about fences anymore. It wasn't even about rules. It was about power. Brenda wasn't just building a uniform community. She was building her kingdom, brick by brick, mailbox by mailbox, until she stood at the top. And my fence, that was the last obstacle standing in her way. When the final notice came, taped to my front door like a scarlet letter, I felt the weight of it. You have 30 days to remove your fence. If you do not comply, the HOA will take action on your behalf and bill you for the costs incurred. 30 days. That was the ultimatum. I looked out across my yard at that fence, the barrier that had kept us safe for years. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. It had done its job perfectly, and yet, in Brenda's kingdom, there was no room for ugly, no matter how essential it was. Little did she know, the day she ordered that demolition, she wasn't just tearing down a fence, she was tearing down the first domino in a chain reaction that would topple her entire empire. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in my lab, elbow deep in soil samples. "Son," George's voice crackled through the phone, urgent and heavy. "They're here. Brenda's got a crew with her. They're taking your fence down right now." For a moment, I thought he was joking. Then I heard the metallic clanging in the background and the muffled sound of engines. My stomach dropped. I ripped off my lab coat, mumbled an apology to my assistant, and broke every speed limit on the way home. When I skidded into my driveway, the sight in front of me turned my blood cold. 3 men were yanking the posts of my $5,000 fence out of the ground, tossing the insulators and wires into a careless heap like scrap metal. And there, standing at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, chin lifted high, was Brenda. She wore a bright canary yellow tennis skirt, her perfect manicure glinting as she clutched a clipboard. She looked less like a president and more like a dictator, who had just conquered a nation. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, striding toward her. She didn't even flinch. In fact, she smiled. "I'm enforcing the board's decision, Mr. Harrison," she said coolly, holding up a sheet of paper. This is the invoice. You'll see there's also a $1,000 fine for your non-compliance. Payment due in 15 days. Her audacity nearly knocked the air out of me. She had trespassed on my property, destroyed my fence without legal authority, and now she wanted me to pay for it. I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles went white. Brenda, you have no idea what you've just done. You haven't only destroyed my property, you've endangered every single person in this neighborhood. She rolled her eyes. Oh, please, it's a fence. Now we'll finally have a uniform community. You should be thanking me. And with that, she spun on her heel, climbed into her pristine Range Rover, and drove away, leaving me standing in the ruins of the only thing that had kept the wilderness at bay. For a long minute, I just stared at the empty space where my fence had stood. Rage burned hot in my chest, but underneath it was something colder, sharper. Resolve. She thought she'd won. She thought this was over. But she hadn't just knocked down a fence. She had opened a door she could never close. That night, I sat. In my office? No, my war room. If Brenda wanted a fight, I would give her one. I called it Project Pandora. She had ripped the lid off the box, and I was going to make sure she lived with everything that came crawling out. And this wouldn't be the kind of revenge served hot in a burst of anger. It would be slow, documented, crushing. The kind of revenge that left scars. The first night after the fence came down, the forest was silent. Too silent. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, staring into the dark line of trees, waiting. I knew it wouldn't take long. By the second night, I had proof. My cameras, set discreetly along the old fence line, captured a young black bear, probably 2 or 3 years old, sniffing the air. He hesitated where the wires once hummed, as if expecting the sting of electricity. But when none came, he stepped forward. One step, then another. And just like that, he was in. I labeled him Subject 0 in my notes. He was the pioneer, the scout, the one bold enough to test the waters. And I knew he wouldn't be the last. Within a week, the reports began trickling in from neighbors. Sarah, who lived across the street, waved me over one morning while trying to coax her trembling Jack Russell back inside. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "He's usually fearless, but the past 2 nights he just stands at the back door and growls at the woods. Won't even step off the porch." I nodded and made a mental note. 2 days later, Mike from down the block was scrubbing his trash cans with bleach. "Something got in them again," he muttered, frustration dripping from every word. "Dragged the bag 50 feet into the woods. Never happened before." Another note. These were the opening acts, the warning shots. To most, they seemed like small annoyances. A spooked dog here, some scattered trash there, but I knew better. The wilderness doesn't tiptoe. It tests. And once it learns the boundary is gone, it presses harder. Subject 0 grew bolder with each visit. He toppled cans, pawed at bird feeders, and left claw marks on sheds. My cameras caught him 3 nights in a row, each time staying longer. Then came others, 2 younger bears, a coyote, even a bobcat. The vacuum left by the fence was pulling predators in like a magnet. I documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. My database grew thicker by the day, each entry another nail in Brenda's coffin. Meanwhile, her response was laughable. A week after the first complaints, Brenda sent out a community-wide email. Friendly reminder: bird feeders and unsecured trash cans can attract vermin. Please take necessary precautions. Vermin. She was calling 400-pound apex predators vermin. Her next move was even more pathetic. She hired some so-called wildlife control expert, a guy with a rusty Ford Ranger who charged the HOA $1,500 to plant a few flimsy signs around the neighborhood. Bear area, do not feed wildlife. That was it. No deterrence, no action. Just useless metal warnings while the real problem grew by the day. I couldn't help but laugh when I saw Brenda proudly posing next to one of those signs for the HOA newsletter. It was the kind of arrogance only someone in complete denial could muster. But the neighborhood wasn't laughing. Trash cans were shredded nightly, bird feeders snapped in half, porch screens clawed open. Every morning brought new damage, and the community Facebook group was filling with angry posts. Lost another bag of trash last night. Something ripped the lid off my can again. Dog won't stop barking at the woods. Still, most people chalked it up to a bad year for wildlife. They didn't see the connection yet, the direct line from Brenda's demolition order to the chaos creeping into their lives. But I saw it, and I was waiting for the moment when they would too. Because the truth about predators is simple. Small nuisances grow into big ones. And the day was coming when this neighborhood would understand, without a shadow of a doubt, that Brenda hadn't destroyed an ugly fence. She had destroyed the only shield keeping the wild at bay. And when the wild decided to push harder, there would be no stopping it. For weeks, the incursions were limited to smaller predators. Young bears, coyotes, raccoons bold enough to test the limits. But in my line of work, I knew what was coming. Where the scouts go, the king follows. And in our forest, there was one undisputed king. I had studied him for years, tracked him with my team, and even given him a name, Scarface. A massive male black bear, easily 600 pounds, scar etched down the left side of his snout from some long-forgotten battle. He was intelligent, dominant, and cautious. For as long as that fence had stood, he had respected the boundary. He knew the sting, and he stayed out. But now the boundary was gone. The first footage I caught of Scarface crossing into the neighborhood chilled me more than I cared to admit. He didn't hesitate like the younger bears. He didn't sniff the air nervously. No. Scarface strode across the property line with terrifying confidence, his hulking shadow moving with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator who had just discovered a buffet. And once Scarface entered, the destruction went from nuisance to nightmare. The Millers woke up to find their outdoor kitchen dismantled, grease trap ripped open like a toy. A week later, a brand new $1,000 hot tub cover was shredded to ribbons, purely for sport. Scarface wasn't just eating, he was asserting dominance. Then came the garage incidents. One night, my neighbor David, ironically one of Brenda's loyal supporters, found deep claw marks raked across his aluminum garage door. The bear had tried to peel it open like a sardine can, lured by the lingering scent of dog food stored inside. Repair costs over $2,000. The panic was spreading. The Facebook group lit up with posts that read more like cries for help than complaints. Something's clawing at my back door. Kids aren't allowed outside anymore. I saw a huge bear on my security camera. Looked like a monster. Brenda, of course, refused to acknowledge the truth. She brushed off the chaos as wildlife being wildlife and doubled down on her vanity-driven policies. To her, the real enemy was still ugly fences, not the 600-pound beast strolling through our neighborhood. But fate has a way of humbling the arrogant. Scarface didn't care about HOA bylaws. He didn't care about Brenda's Range Rover or her pristine yoga outfits. And one autumn evening, he chose Brenda's home as his next stop. The scene was pieced together later through neighbor security footage and a panicked 911 call. Brenda had left her garage door open, maybe while unloading her overpriced organic groceries. Inside, stacked neatly in a wicker basket, was her designer dog food, grain-free salmon and sweet potato kibble that cost more per pound than most cuts of steak. To Scarface, it was irresistible. He sauntered into her immaculate, epoxy-floored garage like he owned the place. He tipped over the basket, feasted leisurely on the gourmet kibble, and in the process knocked over a rack of golf clubs. A can of white paint spilled across the floor, oozing under the tires of her perfect Range Rover. To add insult to injury, Scarface shredded a bag of expensive fertilizer and used it as his personal napkin. He wasn't angry. He wasn't aggressive. He was calm, in control. When Brenda walked out to put the trash by the curb, she came face to face with the aftermath. Her scream, George told me later, could have peeled the paint off a battleship. And just like that, the problem she had denied, minimized, and ridiculed was no longer abstract. The beast had been in her house. Within hours, she called for an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line of the community-wide email came in all caps. Action, plan for aggressive wildlife threat. At last, Brenda understood what I had been warning all along, but it was far too late to control the narrative. The wild had breached her perfect kingdom, and now the kingdom itself was ready to turn against its queen. The emergency meeting was set for Thursday night, and by the time I arrived at the community hall, the parking lot was overflowing. I had never seen so many residents turn out for anything, HOA-related. Usually, Brenda ruled these meetings with a handful of loyalists and a shrug from everyone else. But now the air buzzed with anger, fear, and anticipation. Inside, the room was packed wall to wall. Parents with restless kids, retirees clutching their HOA bills, neighbors whispering about the bear in Brenda's garage. For once, Brenda didn't look like the cool, untouchable president. She looked rattled, but she hid it beneath her usual mask of icy composure. She stood at the front, next to a projector screen, and launched straight into her speech. "Neighbors, what we are dealing with is unprecedented aggression from wildlife," she said, her voice pitched with urgency. "Our community is under threat, our families are in danger, and we must act decisively." Her decisive action turned out to be twofold: an immediate special assessment, a $20,000 charge per household to fund the construction of a 10-foot-tall concrete wall around the entire neighborhood, a petition to the state's Fish and Wildlife Department to designate our community as a high-risk conflict zone, which would give them the authority to trap and euthanize the bears. The room rippled with unease. People exchanged worried glances. A few gasps echoed when she mentioned the wall's price tag, and when she said the word euthanize, I saw several heads shake in disgust. Brenda, oblivious to the mood shift, plowed ahead. "This is the only way to protect property values and keep our children safe." When she finally asked for questions, I stood up. "I don't have a question," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I have a presentation." Brenda's face tightened. "This is not the time for another one of your lectures, Mr. Harrison." But before she could dismiss me, David, the board member whose garage Scarface had shredded, spoke up. "I think we should hear him out." A chorus of agreement rose from the audience. The tide had turned. Brenda had lost her chokehold on the room. "Fine," she snapped, gesturing at the podium. "Make it quick." I walked forward, plugged my laptop into the projector, and took a deep breath. Showtime. The first slide lit up the screen. The baseline, a community in balance. I explained what life was like before the fence came down. 3 years of harmony with deer grazing, foxes trotting by, and 0 bear incursions. I showed data logs, migration maps, photos of peaceful evenings on porches. Then, with a click, the next slide appeared. It was a photo of Brenda herself, standing smugly as demolition workers ripped the first post of my fence from the ground. The room erupted in gasps. "This," I said, my voice carrying through the silence that followed, "is the inciting incident." Next came the timeline. I showed Subject 0, the first young bear caught on camera. Then the escalation. Photos of toppled trash cans, shredded bird feeders, clawed doors. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering in shock as I displayed dozens of clips, many of them from their own security footage that I had collected. And then the star of the show, Scarface. The video of him dismantling an outdoor kitchen, the hot tub cover torn to ribbons, and finally, the chilling footage of him strolling calmly out of Brenda's garage, lips glistening from his gourmet dog food feast. The room was dead silent. No whispers now, just wide eyes and pounding realization. Finally, I clicked to my heat. Map. A glowing red and orange sprawl across the neighborhood, showing every single documented bear incursion. The origin point pulsed bright red right over my property, the breach point where the fence once stood. The incursions spread like a contagion, house by house, until the entire map burned with evidence. The data is clear, I said, turning back to face the crowd. Every dollar of damage, every sleepless night, every threat to our children traces back to one reckless decision: the removal of this community's only protection. The murmurs grew into shouts. People weren't angry at me. They weren't even angry at the bears. They were angry at her. "You tore down the one thing keeping us safe," someone shouted. "You fined us for mailboxes and now you want us to pay for your mistake? My garage door is destroyed. You're liable." "For that!" Brenda tried to retake control, pounding her fist against the podium. "This is out of order. We have to deal with the threat." A woman in the front row cut her off with a bitter laugh. "You are the threat, Brenda. Your stupidity is the threat." And then, from the back of the room, my lawyer Marcus stood up. He had been waiting, quietly, for this moment. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the chaos like a blade. "Perhaps I can offer some legal clarity." The room hushed instantly. "Based on the evidence presented tonight," Marcus began, gesturing at the glowing heat map, "it is my professional opinion that the HOA board, under the direction of President Brenda, acted with gross negligence. They knowingly destroyed private property that served a vital safety function. They were formally warned of the consequences and chose to ignore those warnings. As such, the HOA is liable for every dollar of damage sustained by residents." Brenda's face went pale. "And furthermore," Marcus continued, locking eyes with her, "any board president who coerces a board into acting so recklessly, in direct contradiction of expert advice, may be found to have breached their fiduciary duty. That opens them up to personal liability." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Personal liability. The board members, once Brenda's lapdogs, now stared at her as if she were radioactive. David seized the moment. He stood up and said firmly, "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Brenda." A dozen voices shouted, "Seconded!" Hands shot into the air. The vote wasn't close. It was a landslide. Brenda's reign ended not with a dramatic speech or a courtroom battle, but with the quiet, devastating raise of her neighbor's hands. She had walked into that hall a queen. She left a dethroned tyrant, stripped of her crown in front of the very people she once ruled. Brenda didn't wait for the rest of the meeting to finish. Purse in hand, face ashen, she slipped out of the hall while her neighbors' voices rose in a tidal wave of anger behind her. The queen had been dethroned, and the court had no use for her anymore. The board, now under David's trembling but determined leadership, wasted no time in damage control. Within a week, a professional construction crew, not Brenda's discount demolition thugs, was at my property. They rebuilt the wildlife deterrent fence exactly to its original specifications. Every strand of wire, every insulator replaced, all on the HOA's dime. 2 days later, a check arrived in my mailbox covering Marcus's legal fees down to the last cent. The $1,000 fine Brenda had slapped on me was expunged from the record, accompanied by a formal letter of apology signed by the entire board. But the reckoning didn't stop with me. The HOA, terrified of a class action lawsuit, established a reimbursement fund. Any resident who had documented bear-related damage, trash. Cans dragged off, doors clawed open, garages mauled, was reimbursed in full. The reserve funds bled dry in a matter of weeks, and David reluctantly announced that a special assessment would be required the following year to replenish the coffers. The irony was delicious. Brenda's obsession with property values had ended, costing every homeowner thousands. Her so-called prestige had been reduced to a line item on a bill marked damage control. And the moment the new fence came online, the incursion stopped overnight. My cameras captured the change in real time. Subject 0 appeared one evening, sniffed the wires, and bolted back into the woods. The coyotes vanished. Even Scarface himself returned for one final inspection. He lumbered up to the new post, sniffed the faint hum of electricity, and let out a low, rumbling grunt, half frustration, half recognition. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest, never to be seen in the neighborhood again. Peace was restored. At the next election, I was voted onto the HOA board unanimously. The newly created role of Wildlife and Safety Liaison was mine, a position designed to ensure data, not vanity, guided future decisions. As for Brenda, her fall from grace was swift and merciless. Isolated, humiliated, and with the shadow of personal liability hanging over her, she put her house on the market within months. I watched one Saturday morning as movers carried out her perfectly coordinated furniture, loading it into the back of a truck. Her pearly white Range Rover followed behind, finally streaked with a few smudges of dust as it disappeared down the road. She was gone. That night, I stood on my back porch, coffee in hand, staring at the forest under the protection of my rebuilt fence. The crickets sang, the pines swayed, and the air felt calm again. I had fought the board, I had fought Brenda, and I had won. In the end, the ugly fence wasn't a blemish on the community. It was the one thing holding it together.